There is a satellite image taken by NASA in 1982. Not a photograph, a radar image. A different kind of scan that doesn't see what's on the surface. It sees what's underneath it. And what that radar image showed beneath the Sahara Desert stopped the scientific team that received it completely cold. Rivers, enormous rivers, wider than the Nile, running for thousands of miles beneath the sand. And alongside those rivers, structures, geometric patterns, straight lines, right angles, the kind of shapes that don't occur naturally, the kind of shapes that only appear when something was built. NASA published the findings. They're in the official record. The rivers are called paleochannels, and they are documented scientific fact. The structures alongside them received significantly less attention, and the questions those structures raise have never been officially answered. Today we are going to talk about what was in the Sahara before the sand. Because the official story says the Sahara became a desert gradually, over thousands of years, through natural climate change. And parts of that are true. But the timeline they give you, the scale they describe, and the explanation for what happened to the civilization that was living there, that's where the official story gets very quiet. And when official history gets quiet about something this large, something covering the biggest desert on Earth, that silence is worth examining very carefully. Part 1. What the Sahara actually was. Let's start with what is not disputed. What is in every geology textbook, every climate science paper, every archaeological record. 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was green, entirely green. From the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the Red Sea, 3.5 million square miles of grassland, forest, lakes, and rivers. The same landmass that is today the most hostile environment on Earth was 6,000 years ago, one of the most fertile and habitable regions on the planet. This period is called the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara. It is not a theory. It is documented in pollen records, lake sediment cores, animal fossils, rock art, and satellite data. Hippos lived in what is now the middle of Libya. Crocodiles lived in what is now Chad. Elephants roamed what is now Algeria. Fish fossils have been found hundreds of miles from any water source in the deepest part of the desert, because those areas were once lakes. The rock art alone tells an extraordinary story. Across thousands of sites throughout the Sahara, in Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, Egypt, there are ancient paintings and carvings showing cattle herds, giraffes, elephants, hunters, farmers, families. People living full and complex lives in a landscape that today would kill you within days without modern equipment. These were not nomads passing through. The sheer density and sophistication of the rock art, some sites contain thousands of individual images accumulated over generations, indicates settled populations, communities, cultures, people who lived in the same place long enough to develop artistic traditions, to teach their children, to build on what came before. This was a civilization, not a city perhaps in the way we define it today, but a civilization in the truest sense, organized human life, sustained over generations in a specific place. And then it ended. Part 2. How fast it happened. Here is where the official story starts to show its gaps. The standard explanation for the desertification of the Sahara is gradual climate change. The Earth's axial tilt shifted slightly over thousands of years. The monsoon patterns changed, rainfall decreased slowly and steadily, and over a period of several thousand years, the green landscape gradually became the desert we see today. Slow, natural, inevitable. That explanation exists in textbooks, and the axial tilt shift is real, that part is documented. But the rate at which it happened is not gradual, not according to the actual sediment data. Studies of lake sediment cores from the region, the most precise record of historical climate available to scientists, show something that directly contradicts the gradual change narrative. The transition from green to desert did not happen slowly over thousands of years. It happened in pulses, rapid, dramatic pulses where the environment changed dramatically within periods as short as a few hundred years. In some records, the change appears even faster than that. One study published in a major scientific journal found evidence that, in some parts of the Sahara, the transition from fully vegetated landscape to near-desert conditions happened within a human lifetime. Not over millennia. Within a single human lifetime. Think about what that means for the people who were living there. This was not a slow change that gave communities generations to adapt and migrate. This was a catastrophe. Rapid, overwhelming, and final. And here is what that raises. When a catastrophe of that scale happens, when 3.5 million square miles of inhabited, fertile land becomes uninhabitable within a human lifetime, where do the people go? What happens to their settlements, their buildings, their infrastructure? The official answer is that they migrated north to the Mediterranean coast and south towards sub-Saharan Africa. And some of them certainly did. But 3.5 million square miles is an enormous area. The populations living there were not small. And migration accounts for people. It does not account for everything they built. Part 3. What NASA found underneath in 1982, NASA's Space Shuttle Columbia carried a radar imaging system called the Shuttle Imaging Radar. Unlike a camera, this system could penetrate the dry desert sand to a depth of several meters and image what was beneath the surface. The results were extraordinary. Beneath the sand of the Eastern Sahara, in an area of Egypt and Sudan that today is one of the most barren places on Earth, the radar revealed an entire ancient landscape. River channels, lake beds, valleys, a complete hydrological system, perfectly preserved beneath the sand, invisible from the surface. The largest of these buried rivers, now called the Kufra Paleo Channel System, was in some places wider than the modern Nile. It ran for over 1,000 miles. Its tributaries covered an area the size of a modern country. This was not a small stream. This was a major river system, comparable to the largest rivers on Earth today, completely buried and completely invisible without radar. Subsequent NASA missions found more. The Radar River, as it became known, was only one system among many. The entire Eastern Sahara appears to have been crisscrossed by an interconnected network of major rivers and lakes that would have made it one of the most water-rich environments on the planet. And alongside those rivers, the part that received significantly less media coverage than the rivers themselves, the radar revealed geometric anomalies. Straight lines, regular patterns, shapes that the geological team noted in their original reports as requiring further investigation. Further investigation that, at least in any publicly available form, does not appear to have happened. The rivers were announced. The rivers were celebrated as a major discovery. Papers were published. Documentaries were made. The geometric anomalies beside the rivers were mentioned in the original technical reports. And then, in subsequent coverage and discussion of the discovery, they largely disappeared from the narrative. Part 4. The cities they found, but the radar anomalies were not the only evidence. Because archaeologists working on the ground, not from satellites, but physically walking through the desert, have been finding something for decades that mainstream history has never adequately incorporated into its narrative. Settlements, everywhere. Not small campsites, not temporary shelters, permanent settlements, stone structures, foundations, walls, evidence of organized construction that required planning, labor, and time. In the Fezzan region of Libya, researchers documented a network of ancient settlements connected by roads. Roads in what is now the middle of the Sahara Desert. Stone-paved roads connecting one settlement to another across hundreds of miles of landscape that today is completely uninhabitable. In the Caucasus Mountains of Libya, structures have been found that predate the Egyptian pyramids. Structures whose construction techniques are not fully understood. Structures built with a precision and scale that raises questions about what level of organizational sophistication the people who built them had achieved. In the Tartaria region of Niger, one of the most remote and inhospitable parts of the entire Sahara, archaeologists found the remains of a settlement containing evidence of metalworking. Not primitive metalworking, sophisticated metalworking. In a place where there is today no water, no vegetation, no possibility of sustaining the population that would have been required to develop and maintain that level of technology. And in multiple locations across the Sahara, researchers have found evidence of what appear to be irrigation systems. Channels cut into rock, distribution networks, infrastructure designed to move water from one place to another across significant distances. The kind of infrastructure that requires not just engineering knowledge but sustained collective effort. Populations large enough and organized enough to build and maintain systems that served entire communities. This is not the picture of scattered nomadic tribes that the standard narrative presents. This is the picture of a civilization with roads, settlements, metalworking, irrigation, and the organizational capacity to build infrastructure across hundreds of miles of territory. A civilization that is almost entirely absent from mainstream historical accounts. Part 5. The timeline problem. Here is the problem that nobody in mainstream archaeology wants to directly address. The standard timeline of human civilization says that complex organized society, cities, writing, agriculture, metalworking, infrastructure, began in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. That is the official starting point. Everything before that is classified as prehistoric, primitive, pre-civilizational. But the Green Sahara ended around 3500 BCE. The same moment that Mesopotamian civilization supposedly begins is the same moment that an inhabited, fertile, potentially civilized landscape covering 3.5 million square miles suddenly becomes uninhabitable. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in human history, or it is cause and effect. What if the people who built Mesopotamia, who appeared, according to the official timeline, with remarkable speed and sophistication, with writing and architecture and agriculture and metallurgy seemingly already developed, what if they came from somewhere? What if the civilization that built Mesopotamia didn't emerge from nothing, but migrated from a place that was being rapidly destroyed? What if they came from the Sahara? The skills required to build the first Mesopotamian cities, irrigation engineering, large-scale construction, organized labor management, agricultural systems, are exactly the skills that the Saharan evidence suggests the Green Sahara populations had already developed. They didn't need to invent those skills in Mesopotamia. They arrived with them. This is not a fringe theory. It is a hypothesis that several serious researchers have proposed based on the archaeological evidence. But it has never been incorporated into the mainstream historical narrative, because incorporating it would require rewriting the starting point of human civilization. It would require acknowledging that everything we think we know about where complex human society began is incomplete at best. Part 6. Why it is buried and who controls access. The Sahara today is not freely accessible. Large portions of it fall within countries with restricted access for foreign researchers. Libya, Algeria, Chad, Sudan, Niger, the political situations in these countries have made sustained, systematic archaeological investigation of the deep Sahara essentially impossible for decades. This may be entirely coincidental. These are regions with genuine political instability, and that instability has nothing to do with what may or may not be buried beneath their deserts. But consider the effect, regardless of the cause. The single largest potential archaeological site on Earth, 3.5 million square miles of land that was inhabited by an unknown civilization and then rapidly buried under sand, is almost entirely uninvestigated. The investigations that have happened are fragmentary, underfunded, and conducted under difficult conditions that limit what can be found and documented. We have mapped more of the surface of Mars than we have systematically investigated the subsurface of the Sahara. And in the rare cases where significant discoveries have been made, the NASA radar findings, the Fezzan road network, the Akarkas structures, the findings are noted, sometimes published in academic papers, and then largely absent from the popular historical narrative that most people encounter. The Sahara contains the buried remains of a civilization that may predate everything we officially recognize as civilization. And it remains, for practical purposes, almost entirely unexamined. Part 7. The sand itself. There is one more thing worth examining, and it is something that the official narrative treats as settled, but which is, on closer inspection, not settled at all. Where did the sand come from? The Sahara is not just dry land. It is covered in large parts by enormous quantities of sand. Ergs, the great sand seas, cover approximately a quarter of the Sahara's total area. Some of these sand deposits are hundreds of meters deep. The official explanation is that as the vegetation died and the soil dried out, wind erosion gradually broke down the surface rock and soil into sand particles, which accumulated over thousands of years into the dunes we see today. That explanation works for some of what we see. Wind erosion is real. Sand does accumulate over time, but it does not explain the depth of the deposits in some areas. Hundreds of meters of sand, in some locations, sitting on top of what the radar tells us is a perfectly preserved ancient landscape. The rivers beneath the sand are intact. The lake beds are intact. The geometric anomalies are intact. If the sand accumulated gradually through wind erosion over thousands of years, you would expect the underlying landscape to show the effects of that erosion. Degradation, distortion, damage. Instead, it looks like it was covered quickly. Like the sand arrived fast, in enormous quantities, from somewhere, and buried what was there almost intact. Fast burial, intact preservation. A civilization disappearing in what may have been a human lifetime. We have seen this pattern before. In Rome, in Istanbul, in Chicago, in every city with a hidden floor beneath its streets. The same pattern, different scale, different location, same question underneath all of it. What happened? And why does the official story never quite answer it? We started this video with a radar image from 1982, rivers beneath the sand, geometric patterns that were mentioned once and then quietly dropped from the conversation. We are ending it with a question that the evidence makes impossible to avoid. There was a civilization in the Sahara. It had roads, it had settlements, it had metalworking and irrigation, and the organizational capacity to build infrastructure across hundreds of miles. It existed during the same period that mainstream history calls prehistoric, before civilization officially began. And then, rapidly, possibly within a human lifetime, it was buried, under sand, preserved beneath the surface, intact, waiting. NASA found it with radar in 1982. Archaeologists have been finding pieces of it for decades. The evidence is in published papers, in documented sites, in physical structures that you can go and touch if the political situation allows you to reach them. And yet it is absent from the history books, absent from the documentaries, absent from the conversation about where human civilization actually came from and what it actually was before the official starting date. The Sahara is the largest unexcavated archaeological site on Earth, and almost nobody is talking about what is underneath it. Find old maps of the Sahara from before 1800. Look at what they show. Look at the names on those maps for the regions that are now empty desert. Look at what those places were called and what those names meant before the sand covered everything and the history books forgot to mention what was there. Then ask yourself why the largest burial in human history, 3.5 million square miles of inhabited land, covered in sand, civilization and all, has received less serious archaeological attention than a single Roman ruin in the center of a European city. Something is buried in the Sahara. Something significant. Something that changes the story of where we came from and what we were before the history we are allowed to know begins. We are not telling you what to think. We are showing you what is there, and what is there beneath the sand, confirmed by NASA radar, documented by archaeologists, visible in rock art and river channels and buried road networks, stretching across the largest desert on Earth, is a civilization that mainstream history has no comfortable place for. Subscribe, because next time we are going even deeper. We are looking at the specific structures the radar found alongside those buried rivers, and comparing them to structures that appear in every other civilization that supposedly emerged independently at the same time on every other continent. The sand buried the Sahara, but it preserved everything underneath it. And what is underneath it is waiting,